What if the next American recession does not hit every state the same way? What if some states enter the downturn with enough financial strength to absorb the shock, while others are already carrying so much debt, population loss, industry concentration, and rising costs that a recession could push them into a much deeper crisis? The United States is facing a growing fiscal challenge. Federal debt is rising rapidly, while interest payments are consuming an enormous amount of government resources. At the same time, economic growth has been slowing, and that creates a dangerous combination. A recession does not create every problem. Sometimes it simply exposes problems that were already there. Today, we are looking at the 21 states that could be among the most vulnerable if the American economy enters a serious recession in 2026. This is not about panic or politics. It is about economic structure, government finances, population trends, and dependence on a small number of industries. The ranking begins with number 21 and moves toward the state facing what may be the greatest combination of risks. Number 21 is Michigan. Michigan built much of its identity around American manufacturing, especially automobiles. Manufacturing represents a significant portion of the state's economy, while the automotive industry supports hundreds of thousands of direct and indirect jobs. But the industry is going through one of the most expensive transformations in its history. Electric vehicles require different components, different supply chains, and, in many cases, fewer workers per vehicle. As major automakers restructure their operations, the impact does not stop at Detroit. It reaches supplier towns and communities throughout the state. Detroit has already lost more than half of its population since 1970, and the legacy of its past financial problems continues to influence the state. Michigan is not vulnerable simply because it is poorer than some other states. It is vulnerable because so much of its economic strength remains connected to an industry that is changing rapidly. Number 20 is Oregon. Oregon has no general sales tax, which means the state depends heavily on personal income taxes. That can work very well when incomes and employment are growing, but during a recession, it becomes a weakness. When high-income workers lose income, businesses cut jobs, and technology companies reduce their workforce, state revenue can fall quickly. Oregon has also faced major changes in its technology sector, while Portland continues to struggle with office vacancies and declining commercial activity. The state also carries significant pension obligations. And after years of population growth, Oregon has experienced periods of population decline. When a state loses both taxpayers and high-paying jobs while depending heavily on income taxes, the pressure can build very quickly. Number 19 is Connecticut. Connecticut is one of the wealthiest states in America, but wealth does not automatically mean financial stability. The state carries substantial debt and long-term pension and retiree healthcare obligations. Another problem is the concentration of revenue among high-income residents. A small number of wealthy taxpayers can generate a large share of state revenue. That is excellent during a booming stock market. But when financial markets fall, state revenue can drop much faster than policymakers expect. Connecticut also continues to face office vacancy and population growth challenges. The fundamental problem is simple. The wealth is highly mobile. The obligations are not. Number 18 is New Mexico. New Mexico depends heavily on oil and gas revenue. When energy prices are strong, the state can enjoy enormous revenue and budget surpluses. But when energy prices fall, that advantage can quickly become a liability. The state also depends heavily on federal spending. Major federal facilities and laboratories support thousands of jobs and contribute significantly to the economy. That means New Mexico is exposed to two forces it does not completely control: energy prices and federal government spending. Add poverty, income challenges, and water stress, and the state becomes particularly vulnerable if the national economy weakens. Number 17 is West Virginia. For generations, coal was the foundation of West Virginia's economy, but coal production has declined substantially over the years. That decline has reduced employment and created instability in state tax revenues. Population loss is another serious problem. Young workers are leaving, which means the state loses not only residents but also future taxpayers and workers. At the same time, pension and retiree healthcare obligations remain. A recession would therefore hit a state that already has limited room to absorb another economic shock. Number 16 is Kentucky. Kentucky's pension situation is one of its biggest structural weaknesses. Some retirement systems have been severely underfunded, creating enormous long-term obligations. Those obligations compete with spending on education, infrastructure, and public safety. Kentucky also depends heavily on manufacturing, logistics, and automobile production. Louisville, Georgetown, and Bowling Green are connected to major manufacturing networks, while UPS Worldport makes freight activity especially important to the state's economy. If consumers stop buying cars and other goods, manufacturing slows. If shipping volumes fall at the same time, Kentucky can be hit from both directions. The pension bill, however, does not disappear when the economy slows. Number 15 is Washington. At first glance, Washington looks extremely strong. Seattle has major companies in technology, aerospace, and commerce. Household incomes are high, but the economy is less diversified than it appears. Technology, aerospace, and shipping account for a large portion of the state's economic activity. When companies reduce hiring, cut expenses, or move operations, Washington feels the impact quickly. Housing costs are another major problem. High home prices combined with expensive living costs can leave households with very little financial flexibility. And because Washington does not have a traditional state income tax, the state relies heavily on other forms of taxation, including sales taxes. If consumers spend less, state revenue can fall. Number 14 is Alaska. Alaska has enormous natural resources, but much of its economic strength depends on oil. That makes the state extremely sensitive to energy prices. When oil prices collapse, government revenue can fall dramatically. The state's small population makes the problem even more difficult because there are fewer taxpayers supporting the public system. Alaska also faces high food and heating costs and has experienced population losses. Its financial reserves have provided protection in the past, but those reserves are not unlimited. A state can be incredibly rich in natural resources and still face a fiscal crisis if the revenue system depends too heavily on one commodity. Number 13 is Louisiana. Louisiana is another state heavily connected to the energy industry. It produces a significant amount of America's energy, yet many residents continue to struggle with relatively low household incomes and high poverty. Energy employment has declined, while public debt remains significant. Then there is the enormous cost of natural disasters. Hurricanes can destroy homes, businesses, infrastructure, and insurance markets in a matter of days. At the same time, Louisiana's coastline continues to disappear. Insurance costs have risen sharply. That means households are being squeezed by two forces at once: a weaker economy and a higher cost of simply owning a home. Number 12 is Arizona. Arizona experienced enormous population growth for years, but growth creates obligations. More people require more housing, roads, water, electricity, schools, and infrastructure. Home prices have risen significantly, while wages have struggled to keep pace. Mortgage rates have made affordability even more difficult. Then there is the water problem. Arizona depends heavily on the Colorado River, and that water supply is under increasing pressure. Agriculture has already been affected by reductions in water availability. At the same time, semiconductor investment and construction activity have shown signs of slowing. Arizona's growth model depends on people continuing to move there. If migration slows while housing, water, and infrastructure costs continue rising, the state's economic momentum becomes much harder to maintain. Number 11 is New Jersey. New Jersey is one of America's wealthiest states, but it also carries enormous financial obligations. Property taxes are among the highest in the country. The state depends heavily on finance, pharmaceuticals, and real estate. All three sectors can suffer during a recession. Office vacancies have increased in major business centers, while pension obligations remain substantial. Population loss adds another layer of pressure. The basic problem is the gap between what households and businesses can afford and what the state must continue paying. Number 10 is Indiana. Manufacturing represents a very large portion of Indiana's economy that has created jobs and prosperity for decades, but it also creates concentration risk. When global demand falls, factories reduce production. When trade slows, suppliers suffer. When tariffs and international supply chains become uncertain, manufacturing communities can be hit quickly. Housing, utility, and grocery costs have also increased. Indiana's low-cost manufacturing advantage was once one of its greatest strengths. But if the world moves toward a different manufacturing model, that same dependence can become a weakness. Number 9 is Texas. Texas is often described as recession-resistant, but no economy is completely immune to a downturn. Texas has a massive economy, yet important parts of it remain connected to energy, technology, and real estate. Oil and gas revenue can change dramatically when energy prices move. Housing prices have risen significantly in many major cities, while sales have slowed in some markets. The state is also dealing with enormous population growth. Thousands of new residents require roads, electricity, water, housing, and transportation. And Texas has another vulnerability: its power grid. The 2021 winter storm demonstrated how expensive an infrastructure failure can become. If unemployment rises substantially, Texas could lose hundreds of thousands of jobs in a relatively short period. The myth is that Texas cannot be hurt. The reality is that Texas is simply large enough to absorb shocks better than many other states. Number 8 is Nevada. Nevada is highly dependent on tourism, hospitality, entertainment, and gaming. That creates extraordinary growth during good times, but it also creates enormous vulnerability during recessions. When Americans lose confidence, travel is one of the first things many households cut. Las Vegas learned this lesson during the pandemic, when unemployment exploded. Now housing costs remain extremely high in parts of the state, while tourism and gaming activity face new pressures. When visitors stop spending, businesses lose revenue, workers lose hours, state tax collections decline, and the entire cycle can accelerate quickly. Number 7 is Hawaii. Hawaii has one of the most tourism-dependent economies in America. Tourism supports hotels, restaurants, transportation, retail, entertainment, and thousands of other businesses. When visitors disappear, the shock spreads everywhere. Housing is already extremely expensive. Food costs are far above the national average. Electricity is expensive, and Hawaii imports most of what its residents consume. That means the state is essentially dependent on a massive supply chain stretching across the Pacific. If tourism weakens while transportation and living costs remain high, households can feel the pressure immediately. Number 6 is New York. New York has an enormous economy, but it also carries enormous obligations. Wall Street, corporate services, commercial real estate, and finance generate enormous tax revenue. But that concentration creates vulnerability. A significant decline in financial sector earnings can create a major hole in state revenue. Manhattan office vacancies have risen sharply. Commercial property values have weakened in some areas. Housing costs remain extremely high, and hundreds of thousands of residents have left the state since 2020. The state also carries massive debt and pension obligations. New York is not poor. Its problem is that its financial machine must continue generating extraordinary amounts of money just to maintain the existing system. Number 5 is Delaware. Delaware is unusual. It has fewer than 1 million residents, but a huge number of major corporations are legally incorporated there. That creates enormous revenue through filing fees and franchise taxes. The problem is that much of this economic activity is essentially paper-based. The companies do not necessarily operate their businesses inside Delaware. During a severe economic downturn, corporate formations and filings can fall rapidly. That means revenue can disappear even when Delaware itself has not lost a major factory or population center. For a small state, even a relatively small percentage decline can create a surprisingly large budget problem. Number 4 is Maryland. Maryland has one of the highest household income levels in America, but much of that wealth is connected to the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area and the federal government. A large percentage of employment is directly or indirectly tied to federal spending. When Washington reduces spending, Maryland feels the consequences. The state also faces substantial debt and pension obligations. Housing costs are high, Baltimore continues to lose population, and office vacancy remains a problem. Maryland may look wealthy from the outside, but a significant part of that prosperity is connected to one enormous economic engine: the federal government. If that engine slows, Maryland slows with it. Number 3 is Illinois. Illinois has one of the most serious pension problems in America. The state carries enormous unfunded pension liabilities, while its pension systems remain significantly underfunded. At the same time, hundreds of thousands of residents have left the state in recent years. Major corporations have also moved operations elsewhere. Chicago faces high commercial vacancy, and property values have struggled. Illinois already has one of the weakest credit ratings among major states. If another downgrade occurs, borrowing could become even more expensive. And that creates a dangerous cycle. Higher debt costs require more revenue. Higher taxes can encourage more businesses and residents to leave. Fewer taxpayers mean even more pressure on the remaining tax base. Number 2 is California. California has one of the largest economies on Earth, but size does not eliminate vulnerability. The state has faced repeated budget shortfalls, enormous housing costs, population losses, and growing pressure on public services. High-income taxpayers contribute a disproportionate amount of state revenue. When those taxpayers leave, the state does not simply lose residents. It loses taxable income. Major companies have moved operations to other states, while Silicon Valley and San Francisco have experienced major employment and office market changes. California's problem is not that it suddenly becomes poor. The problem is that the people and businesses generating a large portion of the tax base can move. The obligations they funded cannot. And that creates a structural mismatch that becomes especially dangerous during a recession. And finally, number 1 is Florida. Florida is often viewed as one of America's strongest growth states. People move there. Businesses move there. Tourists arrive by the millions. But Florida's dependence on tourism, construction, real estate, and population growth creates significant vulnerabilities. Insurance is perhaps the biggest warning sign. Homeowners can face extremely high premiums, while some insurers have left the market or become insolvent. Foreclosure activity has increased. Coastal property faces long-term risks from hurricanes and rising sea levels. At the same time, Florida continues adding residents, creating pressure on power grids, roads, water systems, schools, and housing. The state needs continuous growth to support the infrastructure required by that growth. If tourism slows, insurance costs remain high, and population growth becomes less profitable, Florida's economic model could come under serious pressure. But there is an important counter-argument. A recession is not guaranteed. Economic forecasts can change. Interest rates can fall. Consumer spending can remain stronger than expected. Federal policy can provide temporary support, and some states have enough reserves or economic diversity to absorb a major shock. That is why this list should not be viewed as a prediction that these states will collapse. The more important point is that structural weaknesses do not disappear simply because the economy grows for another year. Debt remains, pension obligations remain, population trends remain, insurance problems remain, industry concentration remains. And when the next downturn arrives, those weaknesses can suddenly become much more important. So watch three things. First, state credit ratings. A downgrade can dramatically increase borrowing costs. Second, population and migration data. When high-income taxpayers move from one state to another, they take a portion of the tax base with them. Third, your own household exposure. If you live in one of these states, pay attention to property taxes, insurance premiums, housing costs, employment conditions, and the industries supporting your local economy. A state fiscal problem does not stay inside a government spreadsheet. Eventually, it can reach the family budget. It can appear as a higher insurance bill, a higher property tax bill, fewer jobs, lower home values, reduced public services, or simply a higher cost of living. The biggest warning is not a dramatic headline. It is the slow accumulation of problems that everyone learns to ignore. A recession does not always destroy a weak system overnight. Sometimes it simply removes the final layer of protection. And that is why the next economic downturn could look very different from the last one. If you live in one of these states, tell me in the comments which state you are in and whether you are already seeing higher costs, weaker jobs, rising insurance, or other warning signs. If you found this analysis useful, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and come back for the next update. Because the numbers are changing, and the states that look strongest today may not be the ones standing strongest when the next recession arrives. Source: uploaded transcript used as the basis for this rewrite.